A sleek, black Rolls-Royce Phantom glided into the parking lot, its polished surface gleaming under the afternoon sun. It was the kind of car that turned heads, a symbol of wealth, power, and status. The man behind the wheel, Daniel Carter, was no stranger to luxury. He had built his fortune from the ground up, transforming a small startup into a billion-dollar empire. To the world, he was a ruthless businessman, a man who valued money above all else. But today, something was about to challenge that perception. As Daniel stepped out of his car, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit, he heard it, a sharp, grating sound that sent a chill up his spine. His eyes darted toward the source of the noise, and there she was. An elderly woman in a wheelchair, struggling to maneuver over the uneven pavement, had accidentally scraped the side of his car with the metal footrest. The deep, jagged scratch ran along the pristine paint, an undeniable blemish on his prized possession. The murmurs started instantly. A small crowd had begun to gather, people whispering, waiting for the inevitable explosion of anger. After all, Daniel Carter wasn't known for his patience. He was a man who dealt in deals and figures, someone who had no time for carelessness. The woman looked up, her face pale. Her frail hands gripped the wheels of her chair as if bracing for impact. I'm so sorry, she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean to. A young man in the crowd winced. Oh man, that's gonna cost a fortune, he muttered. Another woman shook her head. He's going to lose it, she said. Look at his face. Daniel remained silent, his jaw clenched, his piercing blue eyes locked onto the scratch. He reached out, running his fingers over the damage, feeling the roughness against the smooth surface. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Would he yell? Demand compensation? Call the police? The woman looked down, ashamed. Her clothes were old but clean, her hands trembling slightly. She didn't have the money to fix something like this. She could barely afford her medical bills. Seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity. The tension was unbearable. Then Daniel did something no one expected. He took a deep breath, stood up straight, and smiled. Are you okay? He asked, gently. The crowd gasped. The woman blinked in confusion. What? I asked if you're okay, Daniel repeated. That's what matters, not the car. The crowd's whispers turned into stunned silence. Some exchanged glances, not believing what they were witnessing. The ruthless billionaire, the man who once fired an entire boardroom for wasting his time, was standing here, more concerned about an elderly woman than his million-dollar vehicle. The woman's eyes welled up with tears. I don't know what to say. Daniel crouched slightly, bringing himself to her eye level. You don't have to say anything, he said, pulling out his handkerchief and handing it to her. Accidents happen. A child in the crowd tugged on his mother's sleeve. Mom, is that man really rich? He asked. The mother nodded, still watching in awe. Yes, sweetheart. Very rich. But he's nice, the child said, tilting his head. I thought rich people were mean. Daniel chuckled at the innocent words, shaking his head. Not all of us, he murmured. But just as the tension seemed to lift, a voice cut through the air. Excuse me, sir. A security guard approached, glancing between Daniel and the woman. Do you want me to file a report? We can check the security footage. Daniel held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. That won't be necessary, he said. The security guard hesitated. But, sir, your car. Daniel sighed, glancing back at the scratch. A deep groove, impossible to ignore. The logical businessman in him knew it would cost thousands to repair. But for some reason, it didn't seem to matter as much anymore. Instead, he turned back to the woman. Come on, he said with a warm smile. Let's get you something to drink. My treat. The woman's lips trembled. She wasn't used to kindness, especially not from someone like him. I don't want to trouble you. It's no trouble at all, Daniel assured her. Then, with a smirk, he added, Besides, I think we need to talk about how you're going to pay me back for the damage. The crowd gasped again, some murmuring in concern. Was he joking? The woman's face paled. I don't have much, but I can try to... Daniel laughed, shaking his head. Relax. I'm just messing with you. The tension finally broke, replaced by relieved chuckles from the onlookers. As Daniel wheeled the woman toward the nearest cafe, people stood there, stunned. The man they thought they knew, the cold, cutthroat millionaire, had just done something no one saw coming, but little did they know this was just the beginning, because Daniel Carter wasn't always this way. And the story behind why he reacted, the way he did, well, that was something no one could have ever predicted. As Daniel wheeled the elderly woman toward the small cafe across the street, he could feel the weight of the crowd's stares behind him. Whispers followed him, people still trying to process what they had just witnessed. He knew what they expected. That. He would lash out, demand payment, maybe even press charges, but none of those things had crossed his mind. Inside the cafe, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and warm pastries filled the air. The soft hum of conversation blended with the sound of clinking cups. Daniel guided the woman to a quiet corner table, pulling out a chair for himself before sitting down across from her. She hesitated, her wrinkled hands gripping the arms of her wheelchair as if she didn't quite believe she was really here, sitting with a man like him. Her eyes, a faded shade of blue, were filled with uncertainty. "What would you like to drink?" Daniel asked, his voice calm. The woman looked down at the table. "Just water," she said softly. "I don't want to be a burden," Daniel signaled, for a waiter. "A cup of tea for the lady," he said, then glanced at her. "Do you like sugar?" She nodded hesitantly. "And 2 sugars," he added before ordering a black coffee for himself. For a moment there was silence between them. The woman fidgeted with the sleeves of her faded cardigan, her fingers tracing the fabric. It was clear. She wasn't used to someone paying attention to her. Daniel leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "What's your name?" She hesitated as if the question itself carried too much weight. "Margaret," she finally said. "Margaret Dawson." "Nice to meet you, Margaret," Daniel said with a small smile. "So, do you often go around scratching expensive cars, or is today a special occasion?" Margaret's eyes widened, and then, to his surprise, she let out a soft chuckle. "I suppose I've got a talent for making a mess of things," she said, shaking her head. The waiter arrived with their drinks, setting them down carefully. Margaret wrapped her hands around the warm teacup, her fingers trembling slightly. Daniel took a sip of his coffee. "Do you live nearby?" Margaret sighed, staring down at the table. "I used to," she murmured. "But things have been difficult." Daniel noticed the way her voice wavered, the way she held herself, like someone who had been carrying a heavy weight for far too long. "I lost my husband 5 years ago," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "After that, everything changed. The bills piled up. The house. I had to sell it. Now I live in a small rented room. It's nothing fancy, but it's what I can afford." Daniel listened in silence. He had spent his life surrounded by people who talked about money as if it were a game, profit margins, investments, stock options. But for people like Margaret, money wasn't a game. It was survival. "What about family?" he asked. "Any children?" Margaret shook her head. "No, it was just me and my husband." She smiled sadly. "He was a good man. Always said I had a way of finding trouble." Daniel chuckled. "Sounds like he knew you well." Margaret's smile faded as she traced the rim of her cup. "I was on my way to a clinic when I scratched your car," she admitted. "I had an appointment, but I was running late. The sidewalk was uneven and I lost control for a second. I tried to stop, but... She looked up at him, her eyes filled with guilt. I really am sorry. Daniel waved a hand dismissively. It's just a car. Margaret blinked. But it's not just any car. It must be worth... It doesn't matter. Daniel interrupted gently. You're okay. That's what matters. Margaret looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to understand him. People like Daniel, wealthy, powerful, didn't usually spare a second glance for people like her. And yet, here he was, listening to her, treating her with kindness. She took a deep breath. You're not what I expected. Daniel raised an eyebrow. And what did you expect? She shrugged. Someone cold, distant, maybe even angry. Daniel exhaled, looking down at his coffee. I used to be, he admitted. A long time ago. Margaret studied him carefully. What changed? Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then, with a small, almost sad smile, he said, Life has a way of humbling you. Before Margaret could ask what he meant, the cafe door swung open, and a man in a dark suit rushed inside, looking around frantically. The moment his eyes landed on Daniel, he hurried over. Mr. Carter, the man said, slightly out of breath. I've been trying to reach you. There's an urgent situation at the office. Daniel sighed, rubbing his temples. What is it, Mark? There's a board meeting happening right now. Some investors are demanding answers about the merger deal. They're threatening to pull out. Daniel glanced at his watch. He had completely lost track of time. Margaret shifted in her chair. You should go, she said softly. Daniel hesitated. He wasn't used to leaving things unfinished. But something about Margaret made him pause. He pulled out his wallet and placed a few bills on the table, more than enough to cover their drinks. It was nice meeting you, Margaret, he said sincerely. Take care of yourself. Margaret smiled. You too, Daniel. As he stood, up to leave, he felt a strange pull in his chest, as if this wasn't supposed to be the end of their conversation. But duty called. As he stepped out of the cafe, the world around him seemed to shift back to reality. Phones ringing, cars honking, people rushing past. The moment of quiet was gone. But as he climbed into his car, he found himself staring at the scratch on the door. For some reason, it didn't bother him as much as it should have. As Daniel drove toward his office, his mind kept drifting back to Margaret. He had met countless people in his life, powerful executives, ambitious entrepreneurs, people who wanted something from him. But Margaret was different. She wasn't looking for a deal or an opportunity. She was just living, surviving. And for some reason, that unsettled him. The moment he stepped into the boardroom, the energy in the room was tense. A group of investors sat around the long glass table, their faces tight with frustration. His business partner, James, gave him a sharp nod as he entered. You're late, James muttered under his breath. Daniel ignored the comment and took his seat at the head of the table. Let's get to it, he said. The meeting dragged on, figures, projections, and concerns being thrown around. Investors worried about the merger. Some wanted to pull out. Others demanded reassurance. Normally, Daniel thrived in situations like this. He was sharp, decisive, always one step ahead. But today, his focus wavered. He kept seeing Margaret's worn hands gripping the teacup. He kept hearing her voice, soft yet filled with quiet strength. At one point, an investor asked him a question, and he realized he hadn't even been listening. Mr. Carter? Daniel blinked, clearing his throat. We move forward with the deal, he said firmly. The numbers speak for themselves. This is the right decision. Murmurs spread around the room. Some investors exchanged doubtful glances, but no one dared to challenge him outright. After the meeting, James caught up with him in the hallway. What's going on with you? he asked. You're never distracted. Daniel sighed, running, a hand through his hair. Just thinking. James smirked. About what? Or should I say, who? Daniel shot him a look. It's not like that. James held up his hands. Hey, I'm just saying. It's not every day you leave a meeting, hanging because of a coffee break with a stranger. Daniel hesitated. James had a point. He wasn't the type to get involved in other people's lives. He built walls around himself, made sure nothing distracted him from success. But something about Margaret had slipped through those walls. That night, he found himself parked outside the small, run-down building Margaret had mentioned. He wasn't even sure why he was there. Maybe curiosity. Maybe something deeper. After a moment, he stepped out of his car and walked up the narrow path. The dim porch light flickered as he knocked on the door. A few seconds later, the door creaked. Open, and Margaret peered out, her eyes widening in surprise. Daniel? He gave a small smile. I was in the neighborhood, Margaret chuckled. Somehow I doubt that. She moved aside, letting him in. The room was small but tidy. A worn armchair sat in the corner, next to a small table stacked with books. A few framed pictures lined the shelves, old, faded memories. Daniel sat down, feeling strangely at ease. I wanted to check on you, he admitted. Make sure you got home okay. Margaret smiled softly. That's kind of you. She studied him for a moment. You know, I wasn't lying when I said you weren't what I expected. Daniel exhaled, leaning forward. I wasn't always this way, he said quietly. I used to think money was everything, that success meant winning, no matter the cost. Margaret tilted her head. And now? Daniel thought about it. About the years he spent chasing numbers, making ruthless decisions, shutting people out. About the fact that, for the first time in a long time, he had spent an entire afternoon talking to someone without expecting anything in return. Now, I'm not so sure, he admitted. Margaret's eyes softened. Sometimes the best things in life aren't things at all. Daniel let those words settle. A comfortable silence filled the room before Margaret reached over and patted his hand gently. You're a good man, Daniel, even if you don't see it yet. For the first time in years, Daniel felt something shift inside him, something lighter, something real. As he stood to leave, he turned back to her. Margaret, if you ever need anything at all, just call me. She smiled warmly. I'll keep that in mind. As Daniel walked back to his car, he glanced at the scratch on the door. It was still there, a reminder of how this day had started. But now it didn't feel like damage. It felt like a mark of something bigger. A reminder that sometimes the most unexpected moments are the ones that change us the most. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel Carter drove away, not thinking about deals or numbers. He drove away thinking about life,